Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Sandra Walklate, Emeritus and honorary professor at the University of Liverpool, having held the Eleanor Rathbone Chair of Sociology there from 2006 to 2025. She is an adjunct professor at QUT in Brisbane, a research associate at the University of West Virginia Centre for Violence Research, and a member of the advisory board of the Observatory Permanent Violence and Crime, Portugal. Internationally recognized for her work in victimology and violence against women, her recent work includes The Criminalization of Violence Against Women in 2024 and What is to be Done About Violence Against Women, Gendered Violence in the 21st Century, published in 2023. I welcome Sandra Walklate to Savage Minds. I invited you to the show because I have read your work on the subject of femicide. As we have discussed via our email conversations, I am quite disturbed by Italy's adaptation of this, what many people, feminists here, believe will be a revolution for women, where this will equate to, one, murder rates of women going down, to which I have seen no empirical evidence in previous research of this. Second, they celebrate this because, and I do believe this is erroneous, they believe that all murders of women, all, are femicide. And as an anthropologist, I regard femicide as something very specific that does not mean any man or woman, we would have to make that argument too, I guess, guilty of killing another woman, that somehow constitutes femicide. I wrote you many of my concerns about this kind of appellation, and not just the name, it's really the ideology behind it, that somehow men kill women because they are women. And to that I question, what on earth does that mean? Because, and I am not a criminologist, but from what I do know about criminality, is that there are a series of issues that come to play depending on the psychopathology of the criminal, to the relationships between the two parties. And I'm wondering if you might begin by discussing your work on this subject and maybe begin to chip away at my questions, because I am very upset about this. I do not view this decision in Italy or in other countries, by the way, as a victory for women. I regard this as a kind of muddying the waters around criminology, because I would like to know, as a victim of a crime myself, not why, who cares why someone kills someone else? The grieving families are dealing with a dead family member, a dead child, a dead cousin, neighbor, what have you. And I worry that by giving it this kind of moral ticketing of femicide, that people are now dusting this off as fixed, where I believe we're eschewing the larger responsibilities from policing to the judiciary of understanding other motives behind violence, which are often interpersonal, often, not always, often monetary. We see this when I was living in India. It was very common. You'd read in the papers in Karnataka about a farmer killing the next farmer because he planted a papaya tree on his land or whatnot. Very brutal killings. But often killings are about survival. And when they're not, they're a passion. But then this begs the question, and I have consulted a friend who's a criminal lawyer here. He says in Italy, they don't investigate women killing men. I've had several clients murdered by their wives, and they will not investigate it. They won't even investigate the aspect of poisoning. So I begin to worry that we're trying to make, as per hate crime laws over the past 25, 30 years that have been slowly brought into vigor in many Western countries, that we're down that same kind of slippery slope where we can claim to solve a problem by giving it a label, and that's sort of a fake label, if you follow.
Wow, there is a lot in what you've just said. No, I appreciate the questions, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the way in which you've presented these issues. And it is indeed a contested issue and a complicated issue. If I just start perhaps back where you started about the law. Um, there are different views about what the law can and cannot achieve. But in general terms, there is a kind of belief that the law sends out a symbolic message about what's acceptable and not acceptable in a particular society at any point in time. And to my mind, to expect more than that from the law is misguided. So, your point that perhaps there's a belief that once you actually send out a symbolic message that this is wrong, that particular behaviour goes down or disappears or whatever, and that patently isn't the case across a whole range of crimes, not just murder or femicide. So there's a kind of conflation there, I think, between what people see as an accomplishment in getting a particular law passed that addresses a particular issue and what can be achieved by doing that. And I think a lot of energy has been put into trying to get the law to recognise femicide as a specific crime, conflates, as you rightly point out, a whole range of issues to do with how we understand what counts as femicide. And I'm using the word counting in two different ways there. Firstly, how we count particular events, and in counting those events, whose life matters. So that's a slightly different interpretation of counting. So if I can just roll you back a little bit, and it's interesting that you say you're an anthropologist, so maybe you'll appreciate this observation. There's an American social scientist, I'll call her, called Vernemont, who published a book in 2019 called Numbered Lives. And she traces, sorry, these headphones are annoying me a little bit. She traces the way in which deaths have been counted from the 1700s onwards. And if you look at the history of death counting, the only deaths that were counted for, in terms of data purposes, were men's deaths. And not all men's deaths, just men who had property. Yeah, because the loss of their life carried economic consequences for the community, either as landowners or employers of what in English terms would be called serfs or whatever. And she traces that kind of development of how lives are counted right through to the present day as a way of trying to make sense of the way in which that way of counting deaths through, imperial developments and colonialism, etc., valued some lives, so that you get the conflation between the actual numbers and whose lives matter, valued some lives more than others. So, from that perspective, I can see that having some recognition in the law from which usually follows the ability to count the numbers, that having a law around femicide matters, because then you start to get the numbers of women who are killed by men. Let's just use that phrase for the minute. So I can understand the energy that's been put behind the creation of those laws from that perspective. And also added to that, I know we talked a little bit about femininicide, which tries to draw attention to the complicity of the state in hiding the numbers of women's deaths killed at the hand of men, largely emanating out of South America and connected with the whole concept of the disappeared, and whose lives were disappeared, if you like, with state impunity, with no compunction on the part of the state to pursue why those lives were disappeared. And some of that was about addressing, criminal cartels, drug cartels, and the impunity with which women's lives were treated in certain South American states. So some writers have wanted to extend the definition of the way in which we count femicide into femininicide, which is, as I say, trying to point to the role of the state in hiding how many women lose their lives. And then in addition to that, and in part, this is part of what I've written about with colleagues in Australia, we tried to incorporate into that way of thinking the notion of slow femicide. In other words, the number of women's lives who are lost because of the illnesses that follow on from living with the stress of violence in their lives. And there's lots of evidence around that, whether that's from women's propensity to commit suicide, whether it's the long-term effects of experiencing strangulation as a feature of that violence, or that just the general levels of stress levels on the associated diseases that come with that result in an early death for the woman. Now, all of that taken together is actually about getting the numbers right, if you see what I mean. It's about recognizing there's been a problem hidden here, and in order to make sense of that problem, we need more accurate data. Yeah, and in some respects, I think that's whether we're talking about evidencing the gender dynamics of wartime crimes, or whether we're talking about the gender dynamics of peacetime crimes, which is what we're talking about. Until you've got an accurate picture of what the problem looks like, you can't then begin to move on to, which was in your opening statements, how to solve the problem. Right, and you alluded to some of the things that get hidden in the solution aspect. So I think there is a kind of belief that if you have a law that recognises femicide, that will improve the data collection. I think that's slightly misguided, because it depends how the law is defined. Who does the counting, and what counts. But, there is a belief in that. But from my perspective, the law itself isn't going to change the problem. Yeah. Because in order to solve a problem, just putting it really simplistically, you've got to have an agreement on what caused it. And this goes back to, I think, one of the issues that concerns you, about the assumptions of men killing women and the assumptions that are contained in that kind of assertion. And of course, there's no agreement here. Some commentators do talk about the importance of patriarchal social relations, that manifest themselves in different ways in different societies, but nevertheless are a common feature of many societies. Others overlay that with neoliberal capitalism, which is where introduces different dynamics. But as you rightly say, there's also the interpersonal level. So some criminologists would have a much more kind of pathological perspective on the cause. They would talk about personality disorders at one end of the spectrum, or they might talk about what psychologists sometimes call the toxic trio, the importance of mental health, drugs, alcohol abuse as being, if you like, precipitating factors towards violence, which can culminate in violence between partners. So the picture is very muddy. Yeah, and I think you're right on that. And rolling back to actually kind of think that having a law is going to change that level of complexity is very, very hopeful. And because criminology is an area of investigation that is, as you will know, it's a discipline that's peopled by sociologists, psychologists, economists, political scientists. It's a meeting place. Getting that agreement on the cause is hugely contested. But until you actually think about the cause and its complexities, the solution, from my perspective, doesn't necessarily per se lie in changing the law. It's a complex issue, and obviously, whilst it's symbolically important to recognise that for some women, their lives permeated by violence ends in their death, predicting which women for that happens and which it doesn't is actually quite a tricky business. Yeah. Because in some other work I've written about, relationships are complicated. Sometimes violence stays a constant feature of them. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it stops for whatever stress reason that was being produced in that relationship. It stops. Sometimes, people grow and develop and change. And in order to kind of get a grip of that complexity, we're going to need to look for complex solutions, which to me would be, and I think this was implied in some of your opening comments, is a much more holistic response than the law itself. So you would need to have conversations between education, health, social support services before we even get to the criminal justice system. Let's remember that women who live with violence usually only go to the police as a last resort. They often go to friends, family, the doctor. They might report an injury at the accident and emergency centre at a hospital. You can see where I'm going with this. It's that level of holistic response and the resources that would be needed to create that kind of holistic response are for me where, if we recognise that this problem is complicated, nobody can agree on the specific cause, but it's got all of these factors related to it, then we need a fairly complicated and holistic solution if at the end of the day you want it to disappear. The law itself, again going back to where you started, will not make it disappear. People might want to believe that it will, but it won't.
I hear you. And the thing is my objection is, even before the law, it's this ideology that's being fomented. I'll give you an example. I've done a lot of work on the desaparecidos, but both in Argentina, Chile, and to a lesser degree in Mexico. I was living in Mexico before the crisis of the maquiladores became vast, and before Mexico turned into somewhat of a nightmare. I cannot believe what has happened to my beloved country. It's such a tragedy. Now, when I started hearing about the maquiladores, I was in New York. And it was presented, of course, by feminist scholars as women being murdered. But 30%, the vast majority of people being murdered on Ciudad Juarez is where this began, but all around that area, the total number of murder victims that are female are anywhere between 10 to 18%. Now, I'm like, why are we calling this femicide? This is murder. And I had a real ethical problem about this because I started to look into research looking at femicide. And then I found out more, like loads of more men. Well, because everyone being murdered is being murdered by men. That was the response. The patriarchy, another response. And I'm like, whoa, I have problems with this. First of all, there's a there's a tautology afoot here. Men are bigger than women. We know from statistics and many social science research studies in just domestic violence and who abuses each other in these partnerships that, yes, men will take to physical violence more, but they're not the unique perpetrators. And emotional, psychological violence, gaslighting, the numbers are up for question because as each year goes on and men are getting more and more support to talk about the kind of abuses that they suffer in relationships, and I know the feminists listening are going to eyeball roll at what I'm saying, but men too suffer. There were 2 big cases in the UK last year, one of which was a man who was put outside of his house by his abusive spouse or partner, and the police had to come. He was half naked. And there are many more stories. The kinds of stories that men do not receive the same kindness in tribunal. Now, I'm thinking back to the Sally Challen case, which really shocked me when I first heard about it. And this is before I experienced psychological and other forms of domestic violence myself. I heard it and I'm like, but he didn't hit her. She didn't have to kill him. There was the door. And the feminists, well, you don't understand, da, da, da. And then I lived through what I lived through from lockdown, 4 years of something that is going to make a good movie because, no, I'm actually writing about it. This is incredible what I was put through by someone who was able to very successfully convince me of her mental health issues and so forth and so on. And of course, I did not kill this person, but I can tell you that I've spent the last 2 years having to psychologically repair myself because when you are tortured, and basically this person engaged in a tacit form of human trafficking, having brought me and my children to another country, lies galore, long story. But the thing is when I think about the Challen case, I'm like, oh yeah, I can understand how she did that. Because in what we're finding, I think both medical professionals who specialize in forensic criminology and others are finding out that the effects of psychological abuse are as great as physical abuse. And so you take away murder, but even then you have a lot of people who live very miserable lives because of the abuse that they endured. Now, what bothers me about this appellation of femicide is that, again, going back to Ciudad Juarez, the small percentage of women, yes, they may or may not have been murdered by men. See, this is another thing that feminists do that annoys me. I've worked on human trafficking in Haiti. Number 1 human trafficker in Haiti was a woman. It was a woman. And people don't like those facts, but they weren't the ones excuse me, these kids that were being trafficked were not just being trafficked for rape. They were being trafficked for body parts, for organs. Let's be clear. So everyone has a choice. So we go there. But then we go back to something that you said at the very beginning. And this idea that, and it comes out in your article, which is, I'm so sorry, I'm getting it here on my screen. I'm very sorry. I've got too many things written here. It's the article where you discuss liminality, and I'm really sorry. 1 second, I'm getting the title up. Cheese and pizza, I'm so sorry. Excuse me.
The life is complicated article.
Yes, I've got it here. Yes, I've got it here. It's right here. Sorry, it was supposed to be in bold. Life is complicated. I'll cut this part out. Life is complicated. Journeys, ghosts, liminality, and policy responses to violence against women. Interesting. That caught my eye immediately because I'm a big fan of both von Genen and Victor Turner especially. And in anthropology, the definition of femicide shifts away from this purely individual or criminological field framework. It focuses on structural violence, communal communication, and the state's role in perpetuating gender-based death. Hence, no, not every murder of a woman is femicide, because that has a very specific resonance. It has a specific growth. And I'm not seeing that in, let's say, Italy. I'm not seeing that. And this is where the problem becomes really sticky for me, in a country where you have rising Islamophobia here, huge. And of course, people will assign that to any immigrant from the Arab or Muslim world who kills a woman. But it gets better. We have the small percentage of women, maquiladores, killed, vast majority men. In the industry itself was interesting, because it shifted from being largely female-dominated in the 70s and 80s to becoming slightly more male-dominated in the 90s and the noughts. But then this raises the question, why are we claiming that everything has to do with hatred of women, misogyny, the patriarchy, when in interpersonal relations, gender is often not even an issue? I mean, love is the issue, right? You're killing people over jealousy. You're killing people over betrayal. You're killing someone over they stole your ex, whatever that ex is. I think we're missing the focus on some of the issues that I find interestingly raised in a book that has to do with literature. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Robert Yaus, the author of Question Answer. And he talks about reception theory. He argues that a literary text is not a fixed object, but a potential that only comes to life through the reader's active engagement. And interestingly enough, you suggest that the current laws, like coercive control legislation, are answers to the wrong questions. And there's a mismatch. If the law asks, was there a physical blow? That's the old style question. It provides an answer that fails to address the thick reality of slow femicide, the real problem. And even then, I say the real problem because I think the real problem is violence. And I really have been pushing back the past year on this notion of male violence, because it's like saying female pregnancy. Women tend to be the ones that get pregnant, and there are what's the word? I can't think of the word in English. Oh my gosh, somatic reasons, obviously, why men are doing more of the killing. And when I say that, I wrote you in my email about what I've lived through, very briefly. The fact is that are there studies that show that in same-sex couples that it might be who's the dominant partner? Who decides on the motives of death? Because they're not certainly going to count in the very high rates of domestic violence in same-sex couples, both male and female. They're not going to say to the lesbian, well, you're guilty of misogyny, you're guilty, because you know what I'm saying? It becomes absurd at a certain point. So this brings me to, if we accept that men are naturally more violent due to stature, for instance, does that mean our current legal system is fundamentally flawed because it's trying to punish a biological trait rather than a social choice? Or conversely, why are we trying to moralize crime? And I mentioned hate crime earlier because in my 20s, when this became a thing that started to be passed about in liberal circles, in New York especially, I thought, oh, that's a good idea, but not me today. I think it was a very bad idea because, again, returning to the grieving family, do they care why someone killed their son or daughter? And secondly, why are we moralizing the reasons behind a crime? Understanding the reasons, I totally get. But moralizing it with a ticket, I'm thinking a label, that's the word I want, that gives a different punishment in many countries, that a heavier punishment in many countries. If you kill someone, in Italy now, this femicide law is going to mandate a far heavier punishment than if you just murdered them because she cheated on you. But cheating is now femicide, that it's been mandated within the ethos of femicide, which is insane because I think crimes of passion, my goodness, we have Shakespeare to account for that. Yeah. We don't need to be told that crimes of passion now have an ideological ethos, if you follow me.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's what I was trying a little bit to get at. There's a conflation with having a means by which to count, as in have the numbers about a particular kind of behaviour and the motive for that behaviour. Those two need to be separated out. And I think, there's, as far as I'm concerned, there seems to be, I appreciate the desire for counting, for having data, because unless you have data, you can't really understand the nature and extent of any problem. Let alone this particular problem. But that isn't the same as assigning motive for the behaviour. And as you rightly say, motive, I mean, we've known, work back in the 90s, we would point to sexual jealousy or sexual propriety as a feature of a lot of murders, if we use the more neutral term. So there is a kind of, a conflation of those two things. And it's the same with hate crime. Not that hate crime is actually debated anymore, but when hate crime was first mooted, I can recall in England and Wales, there was a huge debate because, well, surely, hate is a feeling. It's a behaviour you want to stop. You can't stop people having feelings, but you can stop them, punching somebody in the street because they happen to be a different race from you. Can you see the distinction I'm trying to make? And that in a sense, however, if you like, the ideological moment has moved on from those kinds of debates, and now we just accept hate crime as being something that we kind of all know what it is, and so on. But the term itself is, does conflate those things. Does conflate. It's the behaviour that we're finding problematic. You can't necessarily equate all behaviours that you find problematic as necessarily being equivalent to hate. Yeah, so it is does become quite problematic. And I think, partly of what we're talking about here is the way in which those changing values, ideas, and so on have evolved over, if I just talk about the last 50 years when I've been involved in these debates in academia, in particular, because I actually started my work was much more focused to begin with in a far more neutral term, if you like, with just victims of crime. So when you talk to me about grieving families, I can relate to that because I've met them, and you know that in some respects, what kind of impact crime has had on them and what kind of support they're looking for, none of which necessarily comes from the law at all. And not all of them, by the way, are necessarily punitive in their responses either. So that's kind of adds another dimension to our conversation. But over that period of time, so if I was to go back to talking to women who worked in the refuge movement in the early 1980s, they were often dealing with women seeking help who were seeking to leave their partners after their children had grown up. So they put up with 20, 25 years of marriage and they were saying, I've had enough now, I need to get out, and so on. More contemporarily, women are less tolerant of living with violence, whether that violence is psychological, physical, or simply about social isolation. They don't want to put up with that anymore. So refuge movements are now dealing with younger women who are coming to them perhaps with 2 or 3 children. So the demands on the resources for support are just exponential. And that's an issue. So I'm using that merely as an example to say how people's tolerance levels have changed. The values that people want to live by, if you like, and live with have changed. which feeds into the kind of higher level stuff, if you like, if you want to talk about changing the law as higher level stuff that we're talking about. But it doesn't necessarily overcome that problem of the power of the advocacy voice over the reality of the evidence, if I'm paraphrasing some of the things that you've commented on. And I think that's real. And I think that's a problem, because that can sway policymakers and decision makers in particular directions. And I would also say vote catching directions, because some of this is also about securing elections from one term of office to the next. And that might sound somewhat cynical, but I think it's absolutely there. There is evidence of political parties, and perhaps only talking about England and Wales now, for securing the women's vote by offering to pay more attention to the things that bother them. So the role of advocates in all of that has become increasingly more complex in the last 50 years, of the way in which different pressure groups, I don't know if it's the case in Italy, but I know certainly it is the case in England and Wales, and certainly the case in Australia, where I've also worked, where the presence of those advocacy voices influence policy. Not necessarily always rooted in evidence, and that's an issue. But that's the nature of the. That doesn't mean to say we stop asking the hard questions that you're asking. That just means to say that we just kind of, have to take account of the current policy process is a much more complex one than it was in the 1960s or the 1970s. I think that in part that kind of addresses some of the concerns that you have, because, as I say, there's been a growth of those movements alongside a growing awareness of some of the dynamics of the particular problems of violence against women that we're talking about.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I really appreciate what you've just said, because I fear, and again, my younger self was all, I hate crime. But then I'm thinking, would I be happy if I'm told, well, the killer of your daughter is getting an extra 10 years because it's classified as a hate crime, as if this were the kudos to the death? I now regard these extra terms as really problematic. And I do so often, and mostly, I should say, because of neoliberalism. I've come to be very upset by the way that terms like racism have been bantered about, often by white Westerners who use this as, in this era of wokeism, to sort of finger point. And by calling someone racist, they are exonerating themselves of racism. It's been this kind of game that I've witnessed over the past, certainly decade, but even more really. And I worry that this has taken part of the judiciary, in the sense of we can now moralize that this person has not just murdered another, but they've murdered them because of homophobia, racism, etc., etc. And I'm thinking, this is not helping the situation. In a way, I feel like it's making it worse. Because, again, I was coming of age with Thatcherism and Reaganism, and the kind of homophobia that both of these leaders affected cannot be denied. That said, I also dislike what's happened in the past decade or so, where now everyone is being able to purity posture that they're LGB and now all the other letters that have nothing to do with my identity, if I can even call it an identity, been tacked on. There are lobbies, there are clinics, and everything has become, as I wrote to you by email, it's sort of crazy straw time. And in a way, my thinking is this: if you think that I'm going to go to hell because I'm a homosexual, you have a right to think that. I don't think you should be resigned to the margins of society for that. And I think we can discuss that. At any rate, I feel that what's gone on with the misogyny crimes and the way that feminists are cheering on the femicide ruling in Italy, it has very much disturbed me, because what I'm finding out in my work in the UK over the past 13 years and even here in Italy, I've done a lot of work with the gender wars between the radical feminists and the gender ideologues.
Okay.
And one thing that's really upset me with this has been to note that, yes, feminism has painted itself into a corner, if I could say, with this "we suffer, hence we call the shots. We are victims of crime, therefore this is femicide." And I have a problem with this because logically, again, going back to physiology, yes, I think we could count on that men will be the perpetrators of more violence. That said, when you ask feminists, I have, about violence in same-sex female couples, they remain very silent. There is not a peep to be heard. I did have one say, well, at least they don't kill at the same rates. Well, not yet. That there is evidence for murder. It's less. But the violence rates are actually, in many studies, higher. The psychological violence, what I lived through, I would not wish that upon anyone. And I think that this kind of discussion about violence being not male, but just being human, needs to come forth, because I fear that, including in your sector, we're not going to be doing our society any favors to resign murder to a moral issue. I fear that that begins to reflect a certain era of the past, if you follow me. I don't want to go down the Lombrosian path to understanding criminology, if you catch my drift. So I'm wondering if you could talk about even how, despite decades of policy intervention, IPA rates remain stubbornly high. Based on your research, why do existing state responses fail to break through these patterns?
In very general terms, I would say two things. One is about resources. I would say three things actually. One is definitely about resources. Insofar as that, it actually, if you want to support people to live differently with each other, i.e., if you're really interested in violence reduction, then you've got to put some resources into, as I said before, into a whole range of different services other than the criminal justice system. Education would be one, in terms of, and some of this stuff is actually going on, but it goes on fairly inconsistently, unevenly, shall I say, across it. It's often left to, say in a school, it's often left at a local level to decide what are they going to teach in their kind of relationship element of their curriculum and so on. But I think, within that, it is a resource issue. I know, for example, that as our own government has launched its violence against women and girls strategy in December, at the same time, the voluntary sector, that have been there for a long time, rape crisis support services, domestic violence support services, are closing down because of lack of resources. Yeah. So there's one conversation going on at one level and another thing actually really happening at another level. So one would be to actually have a much more holistic strategic view of the kind of resources needed to change the levels of violence across a society as a whole. I think I've also mentioned that in terms of a holistic response, because one of the things that struck me about some of the things that you've been saying as we've been talking to each other, and just rolling back a little bit to the focus in the law and the belief in the law, what and your allusion a few minutes ago to judges and maybe going back to the past and creating murder as a moral crime and so on, is that what never really gets tackled is how the law itself is framed and understood, and the concepts that it draws upon to make sense of particular incidents. And I'm here drawing on some of just one illustration of the kind of work that socio-legal scholars have done on this issue, that of Gribaldo, who did work in Italy, actually. And she talks about how women, when they come face to face with the law, whether it's as a victim or an offender or merely as a witness, they are unexpected subjects insofar as the law can't understand them. The law is framed as in terms of predominantly the white male entrepreneurial person. That person is the reasonable man of the law. That's the kind of person to whom the law speaks. So that any other category of human being, if you like, whether that's someone from an ethnic minority, or whether they're female, or whether they're homosexual, or whatever, misses the mark as far as the law is concerned. The law's language and the way it thinks and what it thinks is reasonable and how it makes decisions is framed in very particular ways. And unless you start to dismantle that way of thinking, you will be forever left with these presumptions that women are unexpected, or homosexual is shaped in a particular way, or that violence has to be understood in very particular ways. So, just going back to, you mentioned the Sally Challen case earlier on, produced a lot of debate in the UK. But if you read the transcript of the final judgment for that case, she wasn't found not guilty. What she was found to, then this is interesting. What the appeals court decided, she was suffering from an undiagnosed psychological problem, i.e., a problem that was undiagnosed at the time, and had served sufficient time of a sentence in the light of what happened to be released from prison. So that wasn't actually wiping the slate clean for Sally Challen, and it didn't actually, and if you read the court transcript carefully, it didn't actually say this was coercive control either. That the court transcript actually denies that, but it does recognise that she was suffering from some sort of psychological disorder that was undiagnosed at the time she committed the offence. But just playing devil's advocate for a minute, you're still left with the question that she did turn up to have breakfast with him with a hammer in her handbag. Now, you see, when I say that, what I'm doing is I'm invoking how the law would view that in terms of intent. What did she intend? What did she intend to do with that? Yeah. Now we could debate that for a long time, and of course it's a decided case now. So I'm just using that as the way in which, once you start to think in those terms, you are invoking a very, very particular understanding of what intent might mean, what reasonable might mean, without fully appreciating the psychological state that she was perhaps in at the time. Yeah. And that's the dilemma. The law, that she was an unexpected subject as far as the law was concerned, because the law isn't framed to make sense of what she did at that time outside of that very male framing of what the law is. So you need to do a lot of work, a lot more work than just introduce a new law to make a difference, if you see what I'm saying. So going back to your general question about why we've had all this activity. Well, we've had some activity. A lot of activity actually in the Northern Hemisphere is focused on the law, is focused on policing, is focused on the criminal justice system. A lot less is arguably focus on support systems and education and so on. Some of that is changing. A lot less is focused on, violent management programs for men. Some of that is changing as we speak. So, why it still stays high is in part to do with the changing levels of tolerance that I was talking about before, partly to do with people speaking more about it, and also partly to do with the changes that have gone on for men, because men are more aware of their own behaviour than perhaps they were in the 1950s, and what was acceptable or not acceptable for a man to be and how to behave and so on. And that's changing too. So that there are more men, you're right to point that out. There are more men who say, but hey, hold on, my wife does that to me, and feel more able to talk about it. So you've got this changing social, economic, political landscape going on, which is slippery. It's difficult to grasp. And yet you've got policymakers and advocates who are still working with a way of thinking that says, this is the cause, we'll do this, that'll change things. Unfortunately, social life's more complicated than that.
I have lived through this with the women's violence centers where I live, and you show up and tell them your story, and they're like pointing to the mural of the woman who was killed 5 years ago on the wall. And it's like, I can't compete with that.
No.
Or when they know that your partner is a woman. And there are some really big lessons I've had to take away from my situation, because all my friends in London, when I told them about what I'd been through, they were shocked. And they weren't shocked about what I went through. They were shocked because they said to me, oh my God, Julian, you're such a strong person. How could that have happened? They read my mind, because while I was going through what I was going through in lockdown, by the way,
yeah,
I was in a new country. I had just moved here. I had Brexited, moved here, and I just thought I was dealing with someone with a mental health issue because of lockdown. So it's interesting how even lockdown played into that, but all the literature that's come out about women being locked up with their abusers, male violence, and I'm thinking, no, we need to come to understand the conflict tactic scale often show near parity in coercive control, for instance, showing that women use controlling behaviors at rates similar to men. However, you argue that these surveys have a thin focus. Yet, the more men I talk to, and I even talk to men here because I've been isolated for years by this person, so now I'm coming out of this cave. I feel like little Kimmy, who was released from the underground cave, and I talk to people I don't even know, and I tell them, well, this is what oh my God, well, Italian men are so terrible, and I stop them. And I'm like, no, we're talking about an Italian woman. And the presuppositions made about who's the violent person and who's not, gender-wise, I think need to be dismantled. And what are alternatives to this? I mean, you did mention earlier men being educated about this, but then you'll have me saying, I think everyone in high school should have courses about coercive control, for instance, because although I was in lockdown and I had no way of knowing what I was involved with, to be quite honest, because it was a very specific situation of my not being able to even leave the house and having to take for truth what this person was telling me. It becomes very difficult for us to teach children to look out for these behaviors in men instead of this is what men and women can do to each other in intimate relationships. Might that be a kind of course that could be introduced in secondary or middle school? Because I've been very critical of myself. Like, how could you not have seen what you were going through? Because I'm a very analytical person. I was working, writing, interviewing people, and thinking I was supporting a partner who had serious issues of rage and jealousy, as she told me, and was seeking psychiatric help for. But in the end, I was dealing with a very deviant criminal. You have frequently questioned if more law is the right answer. Why do you believe that criminalizing behaviors like coercive control might not achieve the justice the victims need?
Because it's a fairly simple answer, actually, because most of the time women don't want their partners to go to prison. They don't. They just want the bad behavior to stop. I mean, that's a very, very simple answer, I know. But
It's tied in with, I think, as well, why they're not prosecuting these crimes in high numbers as we would like to see. And I
yeah,
found this out from my own situation, talking to the women working in these shelters. They say you'd be surprised how many women, they're a step away from the tribunal door or the date and they renounce.
of course. Yeah. Because, in a sense, we're talking in very general terms here, but people tend to forget there's something called love involved in these relationships, and there are aspects of relationships that are bad. No relationship is perfect, and there are aspects of a relationship that people want to hold on to, and they don't necessarily see that sending their partner to prison is going to help them do that, and especially if they've got young children involved too.
They don't want their children stigmatized, I presume, as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, and I just think I mean, it's obviously it's gone global. I mean, criminalised coercive control has been in place in England and Wales in 10 years now. The number of people who are actually get prosecuted is infinitesimally small in comparison to the number of cases of intimate partner violence. So that tells you something 10 years on, that this isn't actually doing much. The different laws across the globe define coercive control in different ways. Some include all family members, some include only partners that are in a relationship with one another. It's just such a complicated landscape. But at the end of the day, as I say, part of my answer is pretty simple. It's and sure, coercive control itself is a contested concept. I know Stark is been attributed with this concept, but it was around in the early 1980s as a way of making sense of some of the dynamics of a relationship. And a lot of Stark's work, if you read it, comes from people who were seeking help, psychiatric help, to make sense of the relationship they'd been in. And that doesn't always necessarily translate itself in a meaningful way to a law that works for everybody.
Yes, yes. And also, one thing that I found here, because we have the same laws here, but they're not prosecuted, even they're archived. Why is this? Well, did you go to the police? We were in lockdown. I didn't. This
Yeah.
person told me she was she was hearing voices. This is what I thought I was dealing with a psychiatric case and I was being supportive and loving. I did not know this person was leading a double life, And the problem is that the time frames here in Italy for certain crimes are so short. And it took me a year to figure out a lot of things, and this person really was good. Really, I mean, brava, very good liar. I'm impressed. It's on a level of a Ocean's 11 style. But at the same time, these crimes leave lifelong effects. This person did great damage to me psychologically, but bankrupted me. And the kind of damage that economic theft does, I myself was guilty of underrating. I just thought, oh, well, you got to wait. No, that can lead to years and years of struggle and not sleeping and having less time with your children, as I have experienced. So I think that we need to work on maybe not calling things femicide and work around structures that can prevent not just murder, but what leads up to it and these corrosive relationships. Are there any people or policies in place or suggested to be in place that might get at this? Because my worry is this, as you mentioned, more and more men are speaking out, but it's not because suddenly women are violent. It's because men too are being educated in nonviolence. They are understanding their role historically, not personally, in this, just as many citizens of certain countries have had to come to terms with, my country was founded on slavery. We committed a horrible genocide 80 years ago, etc., etc. I think what I worry about is the current dynamics of politics, even outside feminism, is very much on the left, inextricably intertwined with a kind of moral impetus that we must find the reasons for and we must declare this bad. And I'm thinking, wait a sec, I'm very far to the left, but I don't think that is very helpful. I think we might ought to begin with dialogues and talk about what violence is. And instead of laughing if men are saying that they feel that they have been subject to this kind of psychological pressure, why not hear them out? I worry that and this is what the police here have told me, they said part of the problem is that you're two women. We've been trained to see violence as only a hulking man beating up a puny woman. And they're not wrong when they say that. But that does not help the kind of violence that many women in my position will be in and are in. So I'm wondering, what kind of policies or theories have you read or heard or yourself been involved with that might shift the discussion away from this finger pointing of patriarchy, misogyny, and now femicide towards understanding? I mean, no one in their right mind would argue that men are doing less of the killing. We know this. But to approach murder from a gender perspective, I don't think is going to get us anywhere as a society.
The simple answer to your question is no, I don't. I mean, I know the last project I worked on was with police officers, and it was to do with coercive control. In fact, it was to do with some of the issues you're talking about the misidentification of who the primary offender was, which is in some respects connects with your notion of it's always the man against the woman, and sometimes if the woman is drunk or behaves hysterically, or when the police turn up, the man says, "Look what she did to me," and whatever. The difficulty of actually identifying who the primary offender was in a particular incident, it was the focus of the project, and talking to those police officers. They spoke with different voices than police officers I'd spoken to in the early 1990s dealing with these sorts of issues. So one has to be optimistic. The police officers from 2023 talked a lot about digging deeper, about asking more questions, about not jumping to conclusions on the as a frontline responder, perhaps dealing with the immediacy of the situation. Might be as simple as putting two people in separate rooms, or it might be taking one of them to a friend's for the night and picking up on the conversations with what went on here when both parties are in a different frame of mind. It's a different kind of conversation. They talk about digging deeper, in which they were trying not to make any assumptions about who the perpetrator and who the victim was. Which is a different kind of conversation than I was having in the early 1990s when I was working with police officers, which then was about trying to get them to take domestic violence seriously at all.
Yeah. I can see you're like, at least things are getting better. And that was my thinking when I was speaking to these police officers, because my victimizer has been stalking me and it has not been pleasant. And in Italy, basically whoever makes a complaint first is the person who's believed. It's like, have you guys not watched any bad American cop shows? I've learned a lot about the criminal justice system here and about policing and the constraints that they are under, because the laws, again, are written, but they're not enforced. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that to have any kind of rights, I would basically have either had to have gone to the police 100 times during this person's abuses or have died. And this is why there's so many murals here in Italy. But I think it's cheapened, I'd say, by always pointing to the femicide rates. Not great. I'm not saying, yay, murder. What I'm saying is that not all violence towards women, in fact, most violence towards women is just not about misogyny or the patriarchy. I think we've got a larger fish to fry here. And I worry that these kinds of arguments are making it harder for women to actually have what they claim they want, which is equal parity in the law and so forth, because what I see happening in my experience is that this could create great ressentiment towards the entire system, and people will distrust it. My victimizer had tried to, as they say, darvo everything on me, which thankfully, thank you, SMS God, for, I had evidence that it was the exact opposite. That I was accused of locking this person up during lockdown. We were all locked up in Italy. This is insane. But the problem is that, again, the scheme of why people do things, from often mental ill health to certain other issues. You've mentioned drunken woman, drug abuse, all of these things factor in. Okay. But I worry that the feminist query and quest going towards the windmills of Don Quixote will result in great disaster, because what men are suffering also matters. And so I asked even the domestic violence shelter here if they also assist men. And they said, no, we're only for women. So effectively, where I live, men who are victims of domestic violence have absolutely no place to go. And that does concern me, because if we're going to treat domestic violence as a social reality, we should not be politicizing it, no?
Good point. Very good point. I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my only defense for, as I said when we kind of opened up our discussion, I can recognize the need for the specific category of femicide in law if your concern is wanting to document the nature and extent of a problem, if you actually want data. I think the issue around having an aggravated offence is that you still get data that becomes conflated, if you like. And I think I kind of have. I think it's important I keep coming back to the importance of data, and unless we know the nature and extent of a problem, we will be forever lost in a kind of a confusing mire of answering the question of what is to be done.
Well, you've cautioned that criminalizing coercive control could lead to more women being arrested via counter allegations.
Yeah.
After seeing these laws in action, both in the UK and Australia, has your skepticism been confirmed?
This isn't necessarily related to coercive control, but there is, particularly for Indigenous women in Australia, the propensity to which they are misidentified as the primary aggressor is a problem. Is a problem because of the way in which Indigenous peoples are viewed in the Australian context. In England and Wales, I don't think so to the same extent, because misidentification is again a complicated process. Yes, people can be misidentified. They can also misunderstand what's gone on. They can also misrepresent what's gone on. There's a lot of misses in there, if you like, that can contribute to the process of actually making sense of what went on here. But for Indigenous women, not just in Australia, but I guess in other countries too, where indigeneity features as a part of people's experiences of the criminal justice process, it is an issue, yes.
Plus the idea that when men are considered naturally more violent than women, I think we miss out on, again, the kinds of situations that erupt in same-sex couples, men included, yeah, and how this is meted out in law. Because in the end, we're going to be reinforcing biases that feminism was fighting against 60 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you see any kind of policy proposals that might work in terms of education, even on the university level?
One of the threads we've been talking about today, that I'm picking up on your questions, is the reluctance in this moment, and you've mentioned this earlier on, is to actually have conversations that make distinctions between sex, gender, sexual identity, sexuality, and so on and so forth. And I think the way in which those issues have been conflated, so that you get these highly contentious debates about gender ideology or critical gender feminists who are into critical gender studies, or and being called transphobic unless you accept that, if you say you're a man, you're a man. Those debates are really very heated. And I think one of the things we could do more of in relation to students is get them to talk about the differences between sex, gender, sexual identity, and sexuality. And sexual preference even, instead of going into the binary, you're either or you're all.